So let's put an object in some water, or any fluid. It doesn't particularly matter what fluid it is, as long as it's a fluid, whether gaseous or liquid. Two things we can say about the object are that it's either going to float or sink to the bottom, and that the object is either more dense or less dense than the water. So let's say there are 3 dots inside this one, 7 dots inside this one, and in a circle of the same area in the water there are 5 dots, because the water is in between the two densities of them. Now, the object will be either less dense, as we know, or more dense than the water. This will cause the object to float or sink to the top. Now, we know that the object will float if it's lighter or sink if it's heavier, just from common sense. But how do we really know that? This guy called Archimedes told us exactly what will happen when we put an object inside a fluid. And that's the only reason why we know anything about fluids, density, and water. Archimedes' principle actually tells us if it will float based on how heavy it is compared to water. So, if we have a bowl and there is water that is very flat, we know that an object submerged in the water, if it will float, some portion of it will be on top and some portion of it will be in the water. Archimedes' principle also tells us how much of the object will be underwater when the object floats and how much lighter a sinking object will be. So, the weight and the reduction in weight, because there is no reduction in mass from an object, but there is in fact a reduction in weight when we submerge it in water. Now, we know that the weight of an object is equivalent to its mass times its gravity, the force of gravity, or the weight of the object. We also know that an object's density is equivalent to its mass over its volume. The volume is the space that the object takes up. If the volume for this object, and the area of water that the object takes up is exactly the same, then we can say it's a constant. So, for this case, we're going to say that the volume equals 1 centimeter cubed. When we call volume a constant, we can now say that mass and density are a direct proportion, because the mass is over 1 centimeter cubed, meaning that it'll be a fraction over 1, which means that it's equivalent to whatever the mass is. So the density will be lower for how low the mass is. So if we have a lighter object, then the object will also have a lower density, because we know that the weight equals the mass times the gravity, and we know gravity is constant for all of these as well. Weight equals mass times 9.8. So we can just say weight equals the mass, because for some multiplier, the weight will equal the mass. And we know that density also equals the mass for a volume of 1 cubic centimeter. Through the associative property, we can now say that the weight equals the density. And so that's why heavier objects will float in water, because of Archimedes' principle stating that a less dense object, less dense than water, will tend to float in the water, and an object with greater density than water will sink in the water. And now that we know that weight is a direct proportion of density, we can say that objects that are lighter will also have a lower density, and so they'll float because of Archimedes' principle.